Let's pour into 3 whiskey questions.
All right, let's switch over to the whiskey question. So we're going to do 3 questions on whiskey. Question number 1 is from one of my favorite followers. She's beautiful. She's my wife. She actually asked me this the other day when we were driving. I figured this would be a good question. How does the choice of grain impact the flavor of whiskey? All right, so what are our main grains? We have corn. What do we know about corn? Corn is sweet. Corn is mellow. Corn is bourbon, right? So most American whiskeys use a lot of corn. That is kind of that robust flavor. You have barley or malted barley. That is your Irishes and your Scotch. It gives you that sweet bread bakery note, right? So to me, when I think of malted barleys, I start to think more of breads. And then again, if I'm thinking Scotch and Irish, I'm starting to think floral notes and things along that lines. We have rye, which is kind of the American version of barley. That is our number 1 grain that grows throughout the Northeast. Rye is spicy, punchy. It's a great grain to give you those spicy notes, pepper, cinnamon, peppermint, things along that lines. And then we have finally wheat. Wheat, again, if you think of wheat bread, you think of sweet. You think of very approachable inside of whiskey, so a wheated whiskey is going to give you that much softer, friendlier note. And then a lot of times there's other grains that are used. The other grain that I see the most would be some sort of oat, and I see this a lot of times inside of different Irishes. So when they pot still, you have to have a certain amount of barley, or malted barley. You have a certain amount of barley, and then you can bring in a third grain. And a lot of times the Irish will bring in an oat or a different grass grain. So again, you'll start to see oat that way. But the main 4 grains: corn, barley, wheat, and rye. So each of these are going to give you a different flavor, and a good mash bill can actually start to combine these, right? So a mash bill is when you combine your grains with your water and allow it to basically start to ferment and create your first kind of very low alcohol run. So a lot of times, a lot of different distillers will bring barley in with corn and maybe rye. And the reason a lot of people like to use barley or malted barley is because it is a great enzyme, and the sugars inside of that are really good at starting to create great fermentation process without having to add a bunch of additives to start to create that mash bill, to start to create your first very low, anywhere from 7 to 10% of alcohol inside of that mash bill. So barley is used a lot of times. So what you'll see inside of a lot of American whiskeys, it'll be 60% corn, 20% wheat or rye or something like that. Then you'd have like a 10% barley, because that enzyme inside the barley does such a good job in creating the right atmosphere to be able to create great whiskeys. So a lot of mash bills, again, will actually be combinations. So what you'll see in Ireland, you'll get a lot of single malts, 100% barley, 100% single or malted barley. You'll get blended in Irish and Scotland, where they'll actually take a bunch of different whiskeys and blend them together. In the States, you tend to get a lot of bourbons, which are going to have corn as being your highest grain, and then you're going to have either rye or wheat or barley, or a combination of the 3 to kind of finish out your mash bill. The funny thing about Canada, which I really appreciate, is when Canada runs, they tend to blend a lot. And by blending, what they do is, so when they run the stills, if they're doing corn, they run 100% corn, and then they'll mix that 100% corn with a certain percentage of rye, a certain percentage of wheat, and they'll blend it together, where America, Scotland, and Ireland, if they're going to make a mash bill, they're actually going to bring the grains together and ferment it that way, where the Canadians actually do it separately. And it's kind of how Canada gets a really smooth, sweet blended whiskeys, and most of their whiskeys are blended on the sheer fact that that's kind of the nature of what they like to do, because the distiller and the blender loves having the options to bring those pieces together, where if you put them all into a mash bill together, it's kind of what it is, right? So it limits your ability to blend different, well, it doesn't limit, it changes your ability to blend. So that's where the Canadians are a little bit different. But to me, the grain is kind of the DNA, right? The barrel is going to give you the most of your flavor, but the grain is kind of the DNA, the essence of your whiskey. So it's a great question for my wife, and I'm a huge bourbon fan. I'm a huge rye fan. I'm starting to like wheated whiskeys, which are bourbon with wheat. And again, I do enjoy a good Irish, a good Scotch. So I try to enjoy all the different offerings out there and enjoy all the different grain options. And again, don't get pigeonholed into a single grain, right? I really like 100% single malts. Great. Try the blendeds. Try an American rye. Try, a Canadian blended something, right? So it gives you that ability. Just because I like a certain grain doesn't mean I always need to drink that grain. Push yourself, try different grains. You'll appreciate that in the long term. All right, so let's dive in here on our next question inside of whiskey is, are single malts inherently better than blended whiskeys? So inside of the States, there are blended whiskeys, but not nearly as much. There are blended, don't get me wrong, but when you think of bourbons, cask strengths and all that, tend to not be blended very often. When I think of blended, I start to think of Scotches and I start to think of Irishes. So especially when they started talking single malts. So what does single malt mean? Single malt means that it comes from one distillery and it's 100% malted barley. Is that inherently better than a blended whiskey? The answer is maybe. So single malt means it just comes from a single grain, single malt, single grain, aged, boom, here it is. Could be watered down. That's not blended, so they could cut it for proof, but that is what a malted or 100% single malt is, right? What is a blended? Well, blended means that they're going to take a bunch of different barrels, bring it together at some point, and add a bunch of different age, a bunch of different flavors to create a flavor. So blended whiskeys, think of your Johnny Walkers, one of the best-selling whiskeys in the world. Those are blended, right? To get the same color, the same taste, week in, week out, year after year, bottle after bottle. The blender basically knows these barrels inside of this part of the rick house at this age is going to give me this flavor, and if I combine this with this other part of the rick house, this other age, and I bring these barrels together, it's going to give me this flavor time and time again. So the blender is spectacular at being able to take a bunch of different barrels, and again, the barrels are all going to taste a little bit different year after year, month after month. So being able to take those different barrels and blend them together to give you a certain flavor profile. Just because it's blended doesn't mean it's watered down or bad. Blended just means that they're going for a certain flavor or a certain taste, and that's what they're going for. Now, some blended whiskeys, they blend it to save costs, to change the proof. Like, there's reasons that they blend a lot of times maybe to save money, but just because it's a blended whiskey doesn't mean it's cheap or not enjoyable. So does a single malt inherently better than a blended? I would say the single malt inherently is different because it'll be affected by the barrel and the aging, and there's no way to go in there and mix it and change the flavor. So there'll be more variability, but it doesn't mean it's better. So again, just because you see a cask strength American bourbon, just because you see a single malt, doesn't mean it's better than a blended. One of my favorite whiskeys inside the States is Wild Turkey Rare Breed, which is taking a bunch of different bourbon barrels, blending it together to create this flavor profile. There are great blended whiskeys, so don't run away from the fact that something is blended or it's not 100% or it's cask strength or things along that lines. The blender is brilliant in what they do. They understand flavors, they understand the aging process, and then bringing things together is really fun. Also, you can kind of start to blend your own. I've did Wild Turkey and Whistle Pig combined together to kind of create a bacon, what do we call it? So instead, we called it turkey bacon, bringing together wild turkey with whistle pig. I do have a poor man's version of Pappy's that I'm going to create a video on, is basically combining 3 different whiskeys to try to create a Pappy Van Winkle-ish style whiskey. So there's a lot of fun, and as you get more into whiskeys, blending yourself is really fun. So again, don't be scared of the blended product. Blended just means those are multiple whiskeys coming together, and the beautiful thing about the blended is the age statement on a blended whiskey has to be the youngest whiskey that's in the blend. So if you had a 10-year, 12-year, 14-year-old barrels come together, it would be a 10-year blend. If you had the same thing and you threw in a 2-year it would be a 2-year blend. So just because you see blend and it's young doesn't mean it is only young whiskeys inside of the blend. By rule, it states that it has to be labeled the youngest blend, so that way the manufacturer is not trying to pull something over on you. So again, just because it's a single malt or it's a cask strength or barrel strength or whatever, don't shy away from the fact there are great blended as well as there are great single malts as well. Number 3, what role does proof play in whiskey for flavor and drinkability? So whiskeys at minimum are going to be 80 proof, and at maximum, you know, they're going to be up there. Most drinkable whiskeys, you're going to be maybe in the 120s. Most, I think, Scotch, Irish, most bourbons can't be more than 180 or 160 proof, which is way up there. Most whiskeys are not going to come off of that strength. But I would say most whiskeys would run between 80 proof and 120. Which again, if you divide proof in half, that gives you percent alcohol. 40% alcohol up to about 60% alcohol would be kind of the normal range. So why would a person want an 80 proof versus 120 proof or something in between? Good question. Well, most distillers, when it comes off the final run, so scotches and American bourbons and things like that will distill twice. Irishes will do 3 times. So when it comes out of the still at the very end, it can be at rates up to about 160 proof. So when they put it in the barrel, they might add water to proof it down, or they might add water to, when they take it from the barrel to the bottle, add water that way to proof it down. And the reason that they add water is to, 1, save money. If I add water to a whiskey, that means my whiskey in the barrel goes longer. So there's always that. But a lot of people do not enjoy a whiskey that fights. So I would say anything that gets above 100 proof and above, you're starting to get kind of a punchy whiskey. There's a lot of ethanol, there's a lot of fight to that whiskey. There's a lot of people that love the fight, that love a whiskey that wants to punch a little bit. My honey hole would probably be about 110. I like a fight, but I don't like to get whooped, right? So, you know, but there's a lot of people that like 80 proof, 85 proof, 90 proof. So typically, it's not always true, but typically a lower proof whiskey, something in the 80s, is going to be a little bit friendlier, a little bit smoother, a little bit easier to drink because you don't have that ethanol punch. But in the fact that they've watered it down, or you know, they've changed the amount of proof inside of the whiskey, you tend to lose complexity in flavors. So higher proof whiskeys tend to be more complex, tend to have more spice, tend to have more flavor than the watered down version. Again, just because you're adding water, it's gonna change the profile. And also when they add water, you actually change the actual compound of the whiskey and it creates a new flavor as well. So the beauty of the system is some people swear by low proof, and some even think you need to drink under 80 proof to really unlock all the flavors that are inside the whiskey. And there's some people that are like, I won't drink anything under 120. So who's right? Nobody. The key is to find the proof that you like, and again, understand that as you change the proof of your whiskey, you will change the flavor. So what I would do, here I have Booker's. It comes in at about 120. This one is at about 127. So what you can do with Booker's is you could actually add that to your glass, start adding a drop or two of water, and say, what did that change? What did the flavors change? Because every time you add a little bit of water inside of that whiskey, it's going to change the flavor profile. And most of you know this, you know, if you've never added water before, but you've had whiskey on ice. The whiskey, when you first drank it, when the ice is first introduced to when you kind of finish the glass, the flavor, everything changes, right? Because that ice cube's starting to melt, it's adding water to the system, it's changing the flavors. So just because you enjoy a lower proof whiskey or a high proof whiskey, again, I've had great, very complex whiskeys at 80 proof. And I've had a bunch of whiskeys at 120 that they weren't complex at all. Now they might have had a strong flavor of this or that, but it didn't make it a great whiskey. So don't be scared to try different proofs. Understand what the proofs are going to bring, and don't walk away from a whiskey without trying it, because an 80, 92 proof whiskey can be just as good as a 120 proof bare knuckle fighter. So that's kind of generically what proof does differently.